Well, it is a real pleasure to be here with Simon Critchley. And you're in town to give a lecture for our BYU Humanities Center. We'll get to this a bit later on. I want to say first, I'm really grateful to Marcus Smith and Thinking Aloud for setting this up for us. This is terrific. It's going to be airing on Thinking Aloud and, of course, broadcast on our center website. We're doing an interview right here, so let's bring attention to the obvious as kind of public humanities. Okay, the humanities enter the public realm. You've had a very successful career as an academic, written many books, several of which have been translated into multiple languages. But recently, fairly recently, you began this blog for the New York Times called The Stone. How'd that come about, and why call it The Stone?
Stone is the philosopher's stone, I guess. The choice was my editor, and The Stone has been going for 4 years. It began in May 2010. I began to write for the New York Times in 2009. I did a book called The Book of Dead Philosophers, about how philosophers die, and that got picked up a little bit, and the Times got in touch about writing something for them. So I did that, and then developed this friendship with this man called Peter Catapano, and we just started to speak regularly, and then we met, and we had this idea. It just came up in conversation about whether we could do a philosophy column or blog, and we got the green light from the Times hierarchy, and we did it, and we got an extraordinary reaction, and it's been the biggest audience on Opinionator, so online Times. It's the biggest. It's been the biggest audience consistently over the years, which is, part of what it's doing is to prove that there is a huge audience, potential audience for serious discussion of important things.
Which is heartening, actually, given the state of public discourse, right, in the country. Which is great. A couple of these pieces have gotten a lot of attention. I'm thinking about essays on there like How to Die in the Anthropocene by Roy Scranton.
Yeah, who's a veteran, yeah.
That's right. Or How to Live Without Irony by Christy Walpole. And two of your pieces are getting a lot of attention, have gotten a lot of attention. One is just out recently, this month, called The Dangers of Certainty, A Lesson from Auschwitz.
Yeah. And
the other is from about two and a half years ago, Why I Love Mormonism.
Yes.
What about these two pieces got this attention?
You can never tell. One thing I've learned writing for the Times is that you can never tell what's going to catch fire or not. You can guess, and there are certain things in terms of level, accessibility, length. Whether there's something in the news cycle which it's going to catch hold of. You can get all those things right, and still a piece it won't take off. So one of the pleasures of doing this is, just watching what takes off and what doesn't take off, and often it will be unexpected. So the Dangers of Certainty, the recent piece, I did as I just had this memory of this man Jacob Bronowski, who presented a history of science, a history of civilization as a history of science television series in the early 1970s called The Ascent of Man, that was hugely important for me. I wasn't from a household that had books and things, so television was what we watched, and this was a very important experience for me. So I had a memory of that, and I then started to just fiddle with it, and then I bought the DVD box set and started to watch them, and then started to watch them with my 10-year-old, and then I thought maybe I should write something on this, and there was no enthusiasm from my editor. I said, well, okay, it sounds okay, but I didn't really sell it very well, and then I did it, and then we had some back and forth, and then this is often what happens, is that the piece changed shape with editing, and then at the last minute we put the focus on the question of Auschwitz, because there's this 10-minute video sequence where he talks about the dangers of certainty, and the consequences of certainty which lead to ignorance, arrogance, and people behaving like as if they have absolute knowledge. And he says this is where that ends up in Auschwitz. So and that it just seemed to catch people's attention. It was it was bad. It's been bad weather in New York this winter. It's people were exhausted and down. It caught people's imagination. So it's sometimes, or it could be the same piece in the summer and nothing would happen. So whatever. So things like that.
It's a great explanation. It's meteorological.
Well, it could
that
be,
explains it.
It could be climate. It could be climate. And whether people are feeling a bit blue or whatever. And this seemed to. And the piece on Mormonism was, again, it was these. I was in Brigham Young University 20 years ago in 1994 and gave a series of lectures on romanticism, and it was a very important few days for me. And I met people, and Jim Faulkner I knew. I met a number of other people, and I was very impressed with the audience. And it was I had some wonderful conversations about Mormonism, which was something about which I was largely ignorant. And I then began to read, following up from the visit, and became increasingly obsessed with Mormonism, I was saying, in terms of what the nature of Mormon theology was. And then I used to tell, stories about the things that had happened to me here. And then I came to the US 10 years ago and in New York, and was very struck by the prejudice against Mormons and how you can't say nasty things about all sorts of other people for all sorts of very good reasons. You can't make racist remarks or sexist remarks, and that's all very good. But you can say what you like about Mormons, right? Mormons, and people will go, oh yeah, polygamy, they believe this crazy stuff, magic underwear, whatever, and that's fine. It's a casually held prejudice, and I encountered that a lot, and it infuriated me. And then at a certain point at the end of this was during the election campaign of Mitt Romney and Barack Obama, and I thought, well, I'll write something on Mormonism. And actually, my wife really pushed me to write it, and wrote it, and then a few days later they decided to put it up. We did some fast edits, and then it just went ballistic. And then strange things happen. Then you spend the next few days getting emails from people which are sometimes abusive. How can you write something which was seen as being supportive of Romney and critical of Obama, whatever. But then I got hundreds of emails from Mormons which were uniformly polite, incredibly polite. People were very grateful, and it was very nice that our faith is being represented in a fair way and not the usual stereotypes. And then they pointed out a couple of theological inaccuracies in my account, which I acknowledged, and I have them all in a folder with me here in Provo.
Okay. Yeah, and actually you showed a couple of these to us yesterday at the seminar.
Yes.
That we should actually just transition the seminar. It was about the book, Faith of the Faithless, which is such an interesting book. In fact, maybe we should go one book, well, not one book, because you write many books, per year, actually, like a couple books here, to a book called Infinitely Demanding.
Okay.
And you make this claim in this book, which I find really interesting, that philosophy begins in disappointment.
Yes.
What do you mean by that?
It begins in a sense that there is something lacking, something missing, something unsatisfactory about the world. So there's a view. There's a view which is a very popular view, which goes back to Aristotle, and Aristotle says this was what the old philosophers believed, that the physiologoi, he calls them, that philosophy begins in wonder. The wonder at the fact that things exist. And that's a very nice idea. And but I don't think that things are simply wonderful. And I think that in the modern world, we begin thinking not out of a sense of, gosh, it's wonderful, but out of a sense of, there are things wrong with the situation that we find ourselves in. So disappointment is a disappointment which can be the experience of injustice, that there seems to be a wrong in the world. It could be a war, a sense of there being a wrong in a situation of war, and or of a government that is acting improperly or whatever, or a situation of, as it is at the moment, of dramatic and radical economic inequality, or something like that. And that it's that sense of there being something missing, which can be a motivation to think. So that sense of, it begins in a sense of disappointment, in a sense of religious disappointment or political disappointment, and that can lead one into a process of questioning. And and so it's not that it ends in disappointment. Philosophy ends for me in a affirmation. I mean, I think of myself as a kind of optimist in the way in which, there's not a deluded optimist, but in the sense in which, the pessimism of the intellect, but optimism of the heart, as Gramsci said. And for me, it's very easy to, particularly when you've been dramatically overeducated, as many of us have, and read too much, to become incredibly melancholic in the face of the world, because it seems to be such a chaotic place, and no one's listening to what I'm saying.
They are right now.
Well, yeah, but actually, I think that human beings have got human beings acting in concert with a certain view of an end in view. I think still have an extraordinary potential, and so to that extent, I'm not kind of melancholic about the state of the world. The state of the world is not exactly great, but things can be done about it.
Okay, so this is interesting. So we begin, in disappointment. We end in affirmation. In between, you have this phrase, this phrase related to ethics called the infinite demand.
Yes.
What is that? And is that like a catapult that gets us from one to the other?
Right. So I've got for me, I begin from an idea that there is what I call a motivational deficit that human beings, citizens, selves have with regard to the world, in particular with regard to participation in political life. There's a phenomenon that is particularly the case in Western Europe of what's called democratic deficit, that less and less people vote, and perhaps even more importantly, less and less people are active politically in political parties. Political party membership has dropped dramatically across Western Europe in the last generations. So there's a kind of motivational deficit, a kind of a lack, and we feel that we're being governed by regimes or bureaucrats, and we're powerless in the face of that. And so it's how the question for me of ethics is not a question of formulating a moral code or a set of laws or whatever. It's a question of how you motivate a subject, a self, a human being to act. And the claim I try and pursue is at the core of ethical action has to be something that does the work of a demand. Something places a demand, a call upon me, a claim upon me, and it's that I affirm. And that the easiest way of illustrating that is in relationship to the experience of, say, faith. That if you have faith, for example, in something like Christ, right? Christ is the way Christ appeared to St. Paul in the Damascus moment, where there's a vision of the resurrected Christ. That's a demand, and Paul then responds to that demand with an affirmation. And so it's finding something like that that would motivate subjects to act. And then I then offer a particular kind of account of what it means to be an ethical self or an ethical subject, which is based on what I call an infinite demand, a demand which demands more from me than I can possibly meet.
Mm-hmm.
And for me, ethical demands, when they're truly ethical, have that character of being infinite demands, which ask of me a responsibility which I cannot fulfill or satisfy. And to me, that is not, again, that's not a source of misery or woe. That's a possibility for endeavor and a capacity to improve and achieve, if you like.
Okay, good. I was just, that's a great segue, because I was going to ask how you attach the idea of the infinite demand to the book Faith of the Faithless, which is, kind of in some ways a follow-up of the ideas of the first book. And that title of the book has a little paradox embedded in it, right? The faith of the faithless, the faith of those without faith.
Yes.
Can you elaborate just a little bit on that, on the paradox, and why the choice of the paradox in the title?
Well, the words sort of, they're an adaptation of a phrase from Oscar Wilde where he talks about a confraternity of the faithless, and then there's a question of who the addressee of the book is, and in many ways, the addressee of the book are those people that would see themselves as faithless, as not having a faith, or faith is something which they have. Faith is something which they have. So the way that will often work out, say, politically, in terms of the debate between, say, progressives and conservatives in the US, is that progressives will say faith is something that they have. We have what, reason or a belief in law or due process. And to try and complicate that and argue that actually there can be different forms of faith. And I mean, the argument in a nutshell is that the faith of this idea of an ethics of the infinite demand is an experience of faith. So for me, the experience of religious faith is a moral experience, essentially. What that moral experience is an experience of, whether it's Buddha, Jesus Christ, the Prophet Muhammad, in a sense, is secondary for me. What interests me is the character of faith and how that shapes a self and gives a self consistency and purpose. And a large part of the book is also Faith of the Faithless. And this was new in my work, is concerned with the question of love. So faith isn't enough. It's not that we just have to have faith. It's that faith has to be undergirded and supported by love. Faith without love is a clanging cymbal or an empty gong or whatever that would be. But we need to, and so for me, it's that idea of trying to rethink morality on an experience of faith, which is not theistic in any usual way, but which is underpinned by a human experience of love, where love is the capacity to give something that you do not have and to receive something over which you have no power. And for me, that's the kind of the paradox and the power of love is love is something, to love someone is not to be able to control them or to be able to determine their outcomes. You give what you do not have. You do not really have it. You can try and express love. And what you get back, which theologically would be an experience of grace, is something you cannot anticipate. And that's become very important for me. And that's also another area where I'm very interested in forms of religious thinking, the experience of love.
Yeah, sure. It's a very compelling book. Both those books are. Somebody familiar with faith, both philosophically and religiously, I found it really an interesting read.
Thanks.
And I'm wondering about how it plays in, if at all, into your current work. And you're here under the auspices of giving kind of one of the two main event lectures that we have every year in our Humanities Center. We do lots and lots of events. We have lots of people here that are guests. But two events are main events. This is our annual lecture. And your lecture is called Tragedies Philosophy, which sounds to me something like philosophy begins with disappointment. Now, disappointment and tragedy aren't the same thing.
Yeah.
But there's something about them which is evocatively similar. And I'm wondering if you are still thinking about the same kinds of questions in this new project, or the questions really are fundamentally different?
I mean, one thing that I like to do is to change course, and I don't really know why, but it's something I've always done. So I was fortunate to get my first book published in 1992, and it was there was a kind of press scandal around the figure it was on, Jacques Derrida, and it did well. It sold okay.
Yeah.
And then what are you going to do for a second book if you're going to write a second book? And there were lots of it would have been easier to write the same thing again, and I decided I didn't want to do that. I wanted to write something completely different, and I've tried to do that. So I think there's a continuity to what I've tried to do over the years in terms of writing. I've tried to retain a kind of consistency of approach and topics, but also I'll change course at certain periods. So this is a new area, and it's been occasioned by a love affair I've had with the ancient Greeks, which has lasted for many decades. Not particularly informed. I'm not a classicist, but I'm very curious, and I read a lot, and also the idea that there is something. Philosophy in Plato begins by excluding the tragic poets, and by excluding a range of experiences which the tragic poets are trying to articulate, experiences of suffering, grief, lamentation, and I want to think about what's going on there, and to try and see. I think, it's early days, but I think there is a very different picture of the philosophical enterprise that can emerge from this set of concerns. And so the lecture this afternoon is going to be a kind of sketch of the kind of experiment that I'm trying to follow at the moment, which might or might not bear fruit. I also like to do work. It's not that I lose interest in what I've done, but my heart's not in it when it's finished.
Right. And
so I like to force myself to think in a new way, and to not necessarily. I know, so the way I'll often work is that I'll have a number of steps. I can make counts from 1 to 10, but then 11, 12, 13 are really unclear to me. You just trust that it's going to go somewhere. And there are certain things like scholarship and using sources properly and trying to write clearly and not using complicated sentences or whatever. But you hope that it will pan out without knowing whether it will or not.
As somebody who works in a humanities center, where so much of the work that we do is within disciplines, but we also work across disciplines.
Yes.
And you mentioned this love affair you've had with the ancient Greeks, but also with literature generally.
Yes.
And thinking across disciplines, have you found this has been fruitful for you? Is it more a case that you work that way in a principled way, or is it just a happy accident that the project demands that you think about something that way?
I don't know. It's more of a happy accident in the sense in which, I've always had a bundle of interests, and in literature, in politics, and philosophy became a kind of way of keeping all those balls in the air. I don't much like what academic philosophy has become. So the discipline of philosophy is not one that really compels me. Philosophy itself, teaching philosophy, is of huge interest to me. It's of great concern to me. But the discipline, I don't know. So I've always been kind of polymorphously perverse in terms of, not respecting any disciplinary boundaries.
Mm-hmm.
If something's interesting, it's interesting, and I will try and pursue it. And that also means keeping your ears open, which I think is very important. That I've learnt a lot from people in political theory, social theory, from classicists recently, from anthropologists, from people that work in very different areas in different ways. And I think one of the problems with the university, insofar as we can speak that way, is that the university is a kind of pyramidical structure of knowledge, which is based on a model of learning that develops in Germany in the early 19th century, with a division of disciplines and faculties and so on and so forth. And I really don't see what purpose that serves at this point. I think that people have, the students that I really like, that I work with, have a broad range of interests.
Yeah.
And in many ways, the way in which technology has developed and the way in which people's interests have developed. I don't agree with this idea of we live in an attention deficit culture and all the rest. I think people are hungry for all sorts of things, but in many different areas. So can an educational institution reflect back actually what's going on the ground? And that would require a more horizontal, collaborative and interdisciplinary organization of faculties.
This is a great motto for a humanities center. Thank you very much.
All right.
Okay.
Okay.
I've got to say, this is great having you here on campus. Thanks for coming. Great talking with you today. Thank you, Simon.
Thanks for interviewing me, man. Thanks. All right. All right. Let's do the handshake.